and welcome to a new video. In this video I want to announce a comprehensive Azul series that I plan to make, and this is going to be the introduction to it. I recently found a lot of success playing the game and won both the most recent arena season as well as the Azul Cup with a flawless performance. So I figured it is time for me to share everything I know about the game, since I spent a lot of time thinking about it and played almost 3,000 games over the last 2 years. So I'm going to I'm going to show some of my strategies and try to lay out my foundation for the game in a way that I hope will benefit practically everyone who wants to improve. Um, the first thing I want to get into, so this video might be a little bit more stale, and I'll get into more general topics, and the next ones are going to be more strategy based. But I think a good point to start at would be to talk about the impact of luck in this game, because one thing that I find very interesting is you look at the leaderboard and you see that there are players who are 1100 plus elo or 1k plus elo, but there aren't that many of them. A lot of the players in Azul, um, even like very strong players, usually stop somewhere in the 800s. You see, there's like a massive clutter of people there, but at the top level there are a lot less. And back when I started playing the game and was around 600 elo, I wasn't too sure how you could win consistently enough to hit the higher elos, because when I entered a turn-based tournament, it wasn't quite clear to me how I could generate an advantage. You get like a fairly low number of turns per game, so mostly it's going to be around 27, and with such a low number of turns for both players, it's not clear that you can find a way to win every game, because there simply aren't as many decisions, right? Like, you have 27 turns, that's not a lot, and you have far less than 27 decisions, because some decisions are very obvious, some of them are end of round situations, and in round 5 the game state is for the most part going to be defined. So you only really get 4 rounds to generate an advantage that's big enough for you to win the game. So when I looked at Zapalot and saw him at 1050 elo at the time, he was the only player to be over 1k elo. I didn't really understand how he could manage to win as consistently, because people even at, let's say, 600, 700 level are pretty good, right? They understand the basics of the game. They complete a column, they build their top 2 rows, they build with adjacency, and as long as they don't take a full floor line every round, then it is quite hard to win very consistently. But he, which only left 2 options, either he's the luckiest player or he knows something that others don't. And of course, it is the latter. So I want to share a little bit about the impact of luck, and that even though there's a lot of luck in the game, it isn't. It is always circumventable in very most cases. If you play optimally, people make way too many mistakes, and you can win very consistently, which which allows for elos, as we can see here. Maybe I should first mention what these elos actually translate to give a clear idea of how hard they are to accomplish, because they really require, especially when you get to the higher elos, and why we see so many people around 800 and not as many people in the higher elos, is that it ramps up massively when it comes to expected win rate. So here we have the expected win rates, and you can see that as a 1k elo player, if you play a 500, you're expected to win about 95% of the games. And while that may not sound extremely high, I think it comes across more when you compare it to what is previously expected. So if you're, let's say, an 800 and you play a 500, to break even, you would only need to win 17 out of 20 games, which seems very doable. If you want to break even as a 1k elo player against a 500, then you would need to win 19 games to offset one loss. And that is going to be a lot harder because you are going to lose a game every now and then. And even though you can win very consistently against expert level players, it is going to be hard to do that in practically every game. Sometimes they're going to get a strong start and they're going to be lucky in a few ways, but and then also you can obviously lose a game by playing poorly, especially if you play real time. Sometimes brain fog comes in and you can't play at your top level in every game. Like it requires a lot of consistency, and also sometimes a runout is very complex and you need to find very specific moves to stay in the game and give yourself a good position, which is not easy at all to do. Um, so that's why it's so hard for people to reach these higher elos, and even harder for people to stay at them. I think a good place for me to start it would be to provide a framework that assists you in winning consistently. Not making bad moves is as important as making good moves, and I feel like people's foundation in general, aside from the players who play at the highest levels, is very shaky. Um, but a lot of it is very easy to implement, what I'm going to talk about, and I think a good idea might be to provide a bit of a summary first before I um, before I go in depth, because this might become a bit lengthy. So let's start with tile counts. Every game, in every game, there are 20 of each tile, assuming that the game ends in round 5, which most games do. That means in a lot of games you can build similarly and chase the same high scoring boxes regardless of what your opponent is doing. You can practically brute force them. To give an example, Danspot in its early stages forced column 2 every game, which of course is a suboptimal strategy, but it can work. And I also did the same with column 3, and it also like played around 900 level with that strategy. So it works more often than you would think, and gives a little bit of an idea about how the game is structured. I would advise to envision your board and your opponent's board as a heat map for future scoring. The high value boxes tend to stay the same depending on the column you've chosen, and while forcing a column in round 1 isn't a new idea, what you can do is to extend it, and knowing what to build beyond that column and keeping track of how many tiles you need to complete those goals. The priority is practically to score points and keeping your board in a state where it can keep scoring. In regards to column priority, you should mainly build column 3 and column 2. Column 4 is viable if you're going first, but it needs a little bit of compensation since it is structurally weak. Column 1 and column 5 you practically never want to build. Every row contributes to your scoring, including row 4. If you're outscoring your opponent across the board, they will need to give you floor line losses to compensate, otherwise you win automatically. So if you build well, if you outbuild your opponent, you're practically free rolling them and make their win condition very narrow. And the last point would be that reactive defense tends to cost you more than it gains. So playing defensively while it's viable in certain situations, and more often than not, you should avoid it and instead focus on keeping your own board in good shape. Alright, I think a good point to start would be to get a little bit into column selection and why I advise to mainly build column 3 and column 2, and the other columns not so much. I'm gonna start with column 5 and briefly explain why you should not build this column. And while it may seem elementary, I think it kind of like shows the structural and problems that come with building an outside column, and that should help. And that should help you gain a better understanding in general of how the game works, or how you should think about the game. So if you were to build this column, obviously you're building from the edge, and that is not great. So first of all, maybe I should mention that you don't need to, because I sometimes see people play a build like this where they build row 1, 2, 3 in a straight line. It doesn't really do all that much. Um, a setup like this, for example, would be better, since you gain more points and your row 1 is a little bit more centralized. It doesn't really matter when you fill in your row 1, as long as your row 2, like in terms of vertical adjacency, which you're trying to maximize when building a column, it only matters that row 2, 3, and 4 is connected, and you will then gain the maximum amount of vertical points if you, as long as you fill in your row 1 and row 5 later. So it doesn't really matter that you build in a straight line, but let's just say you do. It's quite problematic because you simply have very few adjacency options. Let's assume a normal round 1 where you fill out your row 2, 3, and row 1, and then you get a few tiles in row 4 and a few tiles in row 5, which wouldn't be that bad, right? You get 10 tiles, but it is quite problematic since it will be very hard for you to maintain adjacency in your top rows, since you only have one option, which means at some point you are very likely to lose adjacency. And for example, if you lose it here, then you would have gained +1, +2, +3 horizontally, +1, +5. So that would only equal to 12 points in horizontal adjacency. Whereas if you complete it fully, then you would get +1, +2, +3, +4, +5, which would equal to 15. So you don't really want to be in a position where you concede adjacency by default, because it's going to be too hard for you to force a specific box every round. And then on top of that, there are like big structural problems with it. For example, that due to the diagonal layout, you need the same color in multiple rows, which becomes very, very hard to play. For example, in the second round, you would then need to fill in yellows in row 4 and yellows in row 3, which is practically impossible. And your row 3 is a high scoring row, which you should try and keep functional. So that's where a lot of the problems already come from. On top of that, you need a very high number of blue tiles in order to make this viable, as the row 3 blue is also central. So if you don't get that one, you will lose out on even more points. So if you need to get row 1, 2, 3, and 5 blue, that would require 11 blue tiles, which is simply not going to be very easy to come by, since any other column choice your opponent might take will be able to make use of them in row 1, 2, 3 at the very least. So there's already a big color dependency if you ever want to get this row 3 blue. And of course, on top of that, there's also color dependency, needing 10 yellow tiles to fill out this diagonal, right? Row 1 yellow, row 2 yellow is mandatory in practically every game. And if you want the row 3 on top of that, which is one of your only good row 3 options, then it will become even harder. So that's the main reason why building this column is bad, and why you're going to lose a lot of points in due to adjacency struggles and requiring too many tiles of the same color. Needing 10 or 11 of a certain color may not seem like that much, but it really is, given that not all the tiles will actually be placed on the board. Like, sometimes you have to overpay and lose in the floor line, your opponent is going to defend them. If you, like from the first round, self-imposed need 10 or 11 of a certain color in order to score well, that's going to be tough to play. Um, in regards to column 1, why you shouldn't build that one, it's a little bit better because the colors that you need and the pacing of the column works better, but it still rarely is going to be the best choice. So if your opponent doesn't give you a lot of tiles, like let's say for row 4 and 5, you shouldn't really commit to it by yourself or make the choice to build it, since it runs into the same issues. Building from the edge is going to be problematic, um, which I wouldn't recommend. Now we can get into the more interesting columns that you should actually build, which would be column 4. The reason why I advise to only build it if you're the first player is because of this, like, similar issues that come with column 5. It also struggles due to the diagonal layout, requiring you a lot of blue tiles in order to score well, right? Like, the particular issue with this column is that you need a lot of blue tiles. Row 1, generally you would want to complete. Row 1 and row 2 blue you would generally want to complete. Row 4 is necessary for your column. And in order to score well in row 3, well, reds are going to be easy to come by, but you need a lot of white tiles in row 5, in row 2 and row 1. So it's going to be hard for you to really score whites in row 3 practically ever. And that leaves you with not many high value tiles in your row 3, right? Given that you require whites in row 5 early in the game, you will likely fill out whites in row 2 late in the game, which means that if you were to fill in the black tiles in row 3, they would not come with much adjacency either, so it's not a very valuable tile. Which means your row 3 scoring is going to be very dependent on whether you get this row 3 blue or not, and that makes it a little bit hard to play, since you require a lot of blue tiles to really make it viable, or you're automatically going to lose out on a lot of scoring. Which is why I would recommend that you should only build it when you're the first player, because that way you can get ahead on the tiles that you need, and it might still be worth it in certain runouts. Though mainly I would say that if the runout looks good for column 4, you should probably still build column 3. And the reason why, like, building it as a second player is not all that viable would be because you will not get that many tiles going into the round as a second player. Like, for example, if you're the second player, most of the time you will get around 8 tiles. And if you go out of the round, like, let's say like this, that you get like 2 tiles with blues and then like a row 1, let's say you get it with black, then you would go out of the round like this, and you would still be very stuck on building your column and very dependent on certain colors, which isn't all that great. If I was to suggest what you should aim for when building this column in general, speaking about a board heat map and high value boxes, completing row 1 and 2 is not super important, like in their entirety, but in most games you should put yourself in a position where you collect them in every round, and then only concede it if you get compensation for it. So let's say you get row 1, row 2 completed, you would want reds in row 3, they should be very easy to come by, and considering that you would want to often complete your column row 3 in the first round, yellows would be your desired row 4 that you can actually attain, since blues in row 3 might be hard to come by, and whites in row 4 will be borderline impossible, given that you would need 12 of the white tiles to get this row 4. So you would look at something like this if you want to get a high scoring board, which would require you 10 yellows and 10 blue tiles, just to score your top 2 rows, 3 row 3s, and 1 adjacent row 4, which isn't all that easy to accomplish. That's why column 4 is not that great, aside from the other obvious issues, which would be that you don't have a great way of making use of black tiles, which allows your opponent, if they're building column 2 or column 3, which they will often do if you do decide to build column 4, which makes it very easy for them to complete their row 4 or to complete their row 5, and potentially threaten even more scoring with it, right? Like, you don't really have much use for the black tiles. As I said, row 3 will often come without adjacency since you don't have the whites in row 2 early, and row 4 is worthless, and row 5 you will also not be able to get in most cases because it's going to be hard for you to complete your row 5 early in the game, since whites are a contested color early in the game. If your opponent builds column 2, they need them in row 3, and column 3 they would need them in row 4. It's a very problematic column in that sense, which is why I would not recommend building it very frequently. Alright, now I think we can get into the 2 best columns, and in my opinion the second best column would be column 2. Firstly, why is it good in comparison to column 4, let's say? It's got less color dependencies, since you don't require as many of a certain color as you would building column 4, where your scoring is very reliant on getting enough yellow tiles as well as getting enough blue tiles, and column 2 doesn't really have that problem. It has much better color balancing and also better pacing, not having this diagonal issue I drew earlier, and has much more convenient row 3 scoring. One thing I didn't really talk about yet is the fact that there are 20 of each color, and what that means is, if you were to, I can draw up what I would envision as a solid setup for column 2. Needless to say, you don't chase that every game, but if you were to get it, it would score you a lot of points. And it actually doesn't require all that many tiles to get something like this, let's say, where you get where you complete your top 2 rows and get 3 row 3s and 1 adjacent row 4. So the reason why it is quite important to at the very least threaten an adjacent row 4 is because it can be a massive point bomb, right? It would contribute 6 points to your scoring. But going back to my point, you don't really require all that many tiles if you were to build something like that. So how many tiles would you need total in order to score something like that? And how many points would you score? I think those are very interesting questions. So first of all, looking at the blue tiles, you need 6 blue, you need 10 white, you need 8 red, you would only need 7 black tiles, and the last color is yellow, of which you would only need 6. So you would need something like that, which would equal to 37 tiles. And given that there are 100 tiles in play, if you get your fair share, so 50 tiles, it shouldn't be that hard to force something like 37, right? Of course, you're going to lose quite a few points in the floor line and due to merges, so you're not going to actually place 50 tiles on your board in very most games, but getting 37 total tiles doesn't really seem that crazy, right? And on top of that, you also have the option to concede a row 2 or something like that and only get 4 row 2s, or concede a row 3 and get one less, or to not get your row 4. So you really don't require all that many tiles to get very, very good scoring. Because if you think about how you would want to end the game, a board like this would look pretty nice, right? Completing your top 2 rows, getting a column, getting a bunch of row 3s, that will often be sufficient for winning a game. So the point being, it's more important to build well, to build adjacently, to not lose that many points in the floor line, and you will have a relatively easy time winning games. And as you can see by the values I typed out, how many tiles you would require to get a board like that, it doesn't really look menacing to get 6 blue tiles, for example, or 8 red tiles, or 6 yellow tiles. 10 whites might be hard to come by, so it is somewhat optional, but it isn't even that hard. And you also have the alternative option of not going for this row 4 with white, but instead going for blues. Since blues in row 2, you will get them early. Blues in row 3, you will get them relatively early in most games. So blues in row 4 is often also a viable option when building column 2. On top of that, you have even more options, right, to score in row 3. For example, black tiles, you can additionally score them in row 3, and you have many different setups. It's not just that you only have the option to play exactly like this, but you could also instead play very differently. For example, you can also try and get an adjacent column on the left side, which is a relatively common pattern, but something that is not as common in human play, but that bots like to do quite a bit, which is actually quite strong, is to force an adjacent column towards the middle. Since the black tiles in row 5 would be worth 14 points, right? The final black tile would be worth 7 points plus 7 points for the additional column bonus. So if you could get something like that, that would of course be great. Though it's not very intuitive for humans to play like that. I think I would just mention that. It's not the default, but at times it can be the right approach. Now, given that there is a lot of upside to building this column and that's very convenient to play, very convenient to score, what is the actual downside? Why is it not just outright the best column? Let's start with the pacing of column 2, which is a little bit problematic. So let's assume a normal first round, starting as first player. I mean, it would be a very good first round, but you can often get something like that, where you would get your top 3 rows and a few black tiles in row 4, a few red tiles in row 5. One of the issues is in round 2, you don't really have a good way of playing white tiles. So playing them in row 1, of course, would lose quite some adjacency points immediately, which isn't that great. And while the whites in row 2 may look like a good option, like an adjacent option, it's not all that great since you will lose adjacency in other ways. So first of all, you're building from the middle, which in general I wouldn't recommend. I'm probably gonna go deeper on that in a different video since it might just take too long. But I wouldn't recommend building from the edge in the first place. And also in round 2, you might get the chance to fill blues in row 3, but without the yellow support structure, you would then lose points vertically as well. And something like yellows in row 3 without red tiles in row 2 supporting them, you might also lose points like that. So building from the edge is not that great. And well, why do you need a spot to play white tiles in the second round? Because your opponent will frequently build middle column when you're building column 2. So let's say they go second player, they get around 8 tiles and complete row 1, 2, 3 like this. Then they would sit on white tiles in row 4, and you don't really have a good way of defending it, and might just have to let them complete it, which is not the end of the world, but you wouldn't love to just give them the tiles, and similarly, if they're building column 4, then they can also make great progress on their row 5 if you have to concede the white tiles to them. That would be the first issue when it comes to the pacing of the column, is that top row adjacency is somewhat vulnerable or a little bit hard to play. Then the biggest issue with the column is the amount of red tiles required. So of course you would need red tiles in row 1, in row 2 and in row 5. That's all very standard for any column you might build, that if you want to complete both row 1, 2 and 5, or at least give yourself a chance of that, you would need 8 out of 20 tiles to accomplish that, which on the surface is not problematic. Well, the issue is with column 2 is that the red tiles are actually mandatory, because if you lack red tiles in row 1 or red tiles in row 2, you would lose out on a lot of points, and the much bigger issue is the pacing. You will require those relatively early in the game in order to get good adjacency, right? You would want to build from the middle in your top row. That makes it infinitely easier to get maximum horizontal adjacency, and the red tiles in row 2 similarly will make it easier to get horizontal adjacency, but also vertical adjacency, building a support structure for yellows in row 3 that you will often get relatively early, and potentially even blue tiles. So you need red tiles in your top 2 rows, and you need them relatively early. Well, what's the issue? You also need red tiles in row 5, and you don't want to be stuck on your column forever. So instead of needing 8 out of 20 tiles, you have to instead ask yourself the question, at what point do you actually need to complete all of these red boxes? When it comes to row 5, you would want to complete it before the 5th round, because in the 5th round you will need the space on your board in order to not have to take a bunch of floor line losses in most cases, because if you let's say go into the last round like this, and you're still stuck on, let's say you get a bunch of stuff and go into the last round like this, for example, and then you still have a few red tiles in row 5. Well, first of all, you would be very interdependent on your row 4, right? You would require, you only have one row to, okay, you can play a white tile in row 1, but you don't have much space to place white tiles in general, you don't have much space to place blue tiles, and you don't have much space to place yellow tiles. All of these tiles will share the 4th row, and there's a good chance that you are also clogged up on your row 4 in the first place if you were to enter round 5 like that. Then on top of that, you would have to spend a move completing your column, which is one move wasted that will make it a lot harder for you to actually complete your top 2 rows. So you don't really want to go into the final round being stuck on your row 5, which I think is quite obvious. Well, what about your top 2 rows? If you were to leave your row 2 up until the final round, then you would lose out on a lot of adjacency like this horizontally, because you would only score +1, +2, +3, +1, +5, which would equal to 12 points out of 15 that you could get if you build optimally, but you would also lose out on vertical points if you fill in something like the yellows in row 3 or the blues in row 4 and whatnot. So you would lose a lot of points in multiple directions if you don't fill out the row 2 red early in the game. Row 1 is of course similarly bad. If you don't fill it out, it becomes very obvious. You would only get +1, +2, +1, +2, +5 horizontally, so you would only score 11 points instead of the maximum of 15, which means you don't really want to leave row 1 and 2 open until the final round with red, and you don't really want to leave row 5 open because it will make it a lot harder for you to score high value boxes in the final round. What that means is you don't need 8 out of 20 red tiles by the end of the game, but instead you will need 8 out of however many red tiles come out until the end of round 4. Preferably you would want to fill out the reds even earlier than round 4, but at latest you should fill them out in row 4. That means you require a lot of red tiles, which by default can make you vulnerable to unlucky runouts. For example, if the final round contains 8 or 9 red tiles, it will be very hard for you to actually complete row 1, 2, and 5 earlier in the game, because you would require, well, 8 out of 12 tiles or something like that, which is going to be hard, especially since your opponent, no matter what column they're building, let's say they're building middle column, well, they can make use of red tiles in row 1, 2, and 3 early in the game. And if your opponent is building column 4, they can make use of red tiles in row 1, 2, 3 early in the game, right? So you're by default quite vulnerable to unlucky runouts and red tiles not coming out. And then on top of that, there is a color dependency, because you actually need to fill out the red tiles, and you have to be very conscious of that. Something that commonly happens is that players disregard red tiles, a common mistake, and end up in a position like this, where they may have a few red tiles in row 5, but then they go into the third round, let's say with a board like this one, and suddenly they require red tiles in row 1, 2, and 5 simultaneously, which is of course very problematic to be as dependent on a color for your own scoring. So if red tiles don't come out, you're practically screwed, and your opponent of course can also directly defend them, or they can merge those tiles, or make it very hard for you to get, so they automatically gain a lot of control over the round if you find yourself in a position like that. If you were to take reds in row 1 and 2 early as the solution to this problem, that would often lead to losing vertical adjacency if you fill in the white tiles, which of course isn't optimal, but it's still a lot easier to play, making sure that you do get your reds in row 1 and 2 early in the game, and then be able to plunk the remaining ones in row 5 later to have an easier time building your column, rather than in a later round be stuck on these 3 objectives at the same time. So that's what I would personally recommend, is to make sure that you take your top rows with red when you're building column 2, or alternatively it's also perfectly fine to build like this, but you need to make sure that you stay ahead on the red tiles in row 5 in order to make this viable, as to not remain stuck on it and stuck on all of your rows simultaneously. Because one big mistake that I frequently see is that people generally choose columns based on what comes out in round 1, and not enough on what they will actually get. So let's say the first runout contains 6 or 7 red tiles, but you instead waste all of your moves, which generally is a very valid strategy. You spend all of your moves on building this row 3 with white and row 2 with blue, and getting black tiles in row 4, but you don't actually take the red tiles. Well, that will become very problematic in future runouts, because those tiles will no longer come out as nicely, and they will be harder and harder to get, which will automatically lead you to positions where you simply require them in all rows simultaneously later, which is what you would want to avoid. So the main lesson is that if you need a lot of a certain color and those tiles come out, you actually need to take them, or you will have there will be long-term consequences, and your board will likely structurally collapse later in the game. And that doesn't only apply to red tiles. To give one example of how your board can structurally collapse if you don't take the tiles that you actually need for your future scoring, would be this round 1 in a high-level game against Jazz. And I don't want to go too deeply into how we arrived here, but um, this is mainly to exemplify how you can immediately lose a game in round 1 if you don't take the tiles that you need. So, as mentioned, when you're building column 2, you need a lot of white tiles, right? Like you would want to get this row 4 or have a shot at it, as it would be worth 6 points. And your row 3 is mandatory, and you would also prefer to complete row 1 and 2 in most games. So not having taken any of the white tiles in a round is devastating for him. In general, his decision to go for column 2, despite no red tiles coming out in the first round, is perfectly fine, since they are still to come out, which means he can contest them and probably make good progress on them. That is a perfectly fine decision, but if you don't take any of the white tiles, uh, that will become problematic in a variety of ways. So 7 white tiles came out and he got 0 of them. For optimal column 2 scoring, you would require 10, which is now, as a consequence, very unrealistic, given that I still need white tiles in row 2. I can also play them in row 3, and that practically loses his chance to score row for white in the first round, massively limiting his future scoring. On top of that, even getting his row 3 will be problematic, and it makes his row 3 dysfunctional. Your column row 3 generally you wouldn't want to collect later in the game, but rather in the early rounds, like round 1, as lower remaining tile counts will affect distributions. So here we have 13 white tiles remaining, which means we can expect around 3 white tiles to come out in future rounds, which would lead to distributions such as this one, which is the most common one of 1-1-1, making it very hard to complete this objective at any point without having to spend multiple moves on it. And you don't really have time for that. You don't really have time to grab white tiles one by one in order to get your column row 3. So what happens in most cases is that he will have to leave them in the round, which will later give me a chance to deny them and make it very hard for him to make any progress on his row 3, since if he completes his row 3, well, he can no longer score the whites there, or if he places, let's say, 2 blue tiles in row 3 in a future round, well then, if white tiles were to come out, he could not fill them in. So it makes this row 3 very, puts it in a very rigid space, and that makes it very, very hard to play. Also, the further you go into the game, the less options you have in your top rows. So if you have like this massive dependency of getting this high value row 3 that you didn't take in the first round when all the white tiles came out, that will also make future rounds a lot more problematic. On top of that, you of course lose vertical adjacency, and that's practically how you can lose a game in round 1. Ultimately, it led to this position in the end, where you can really see the struggle of not having taken the white tiles early in the game when they all came out. He, of course, did not get the row 4, and the worst part being that he did not make any progress on row 3 at all. Like, having to concede row 2 is not the end of the world, but that hurts, of course. But what's a lot worse is that he could never really get his row 3 to be operational, being stuck on this row 3 white for the entirety of the game. Moving on to column 3. Fortunately, this one is going to be a lot easier, since it doesn't have any of the highlighted struggles of the aforementioned columns and is very convenient to build. Maybe a good place to start at would be to go from a typical round 1 setup that you might get, which would look something like that. If it wasn't clear as for the top row setups, a setup like this is probably better if you go into the next round like this, where you have like the staggered pattern. But I might make a separate video on that. And similarly, if you're building column 2, then something like this would definitely be preferable to building in a straight line. But about column 3, so let's say you complete, just for consistency, you complete the first 3 rows, get 2 tiles in row 4, get 2 tiles in row 5. It practically builds itself. It is very flexible in scoring. It's a very flexible setup. You can play it in a variety of ways, but the main positive of it is that you have a use case for every color in practically every round, which I would define as good pacing. So in the second round, you can play blue tiles in row 2, you can play red tiles in row 2, you have a lot of space for yellow tiles in row 3, you can also play red tiles in row 3 even though they aren't scoring that much. But you are very flexible, and white and black tiles of course go in the bottom rows, which makes it very convenient to play. So I remember games back when I was around 700, 800 elo. I would load into Arena and play against players of 200 or 300 elo, and often I would struggle if they got a 3 blue start to actually win the game, because the column is so easy to build that it's kind of hard to make mistakes. And the reason why it's so easy to build is that the top rows that you're building from the middle in your top rows, which makes adjacent scoring very easy, and the layout of the board. So needing black tiles and white tiles in your bottom 2 rows is great, since you can delay your upper rows, not needing whites until very late in the game, so you can delay it endlessly, and you can devote all of the white tiles that you would want to play into your row 4, and similarly with the black tiles. Okay, the black tile in row 1 you might have to take earlier, but the black tiles in row 2, if you wanted to get that, you could delay it up until the end of the game, which is very, very convenient to play, not having to sweat your row 2 adjacency that much. One quick final comment on why it's so important to build from the middle in your top rows, particularly your row 2, is that at the end of the game tile counts get fairly low. So if you build like this in your row 2, you will have multiple options to pick from in round 4 depending on what color you need in round 5. If, let's say, only 2 black tiles remain in round 5, then you probably wouldn't want to put yourself in a position where you have to try and collect this row 2 in round 5. So in round 4 you could pick the black tiles and choose to fill in the white tiles in the 5th round, which makes this very, very convenient to play, as opposed to a build like this where if only 2 black tiles remain in the final round, then you would likely have to take blacks in round 4 in order to complete your row 2, and then you would miss out on all of the adjacency, whereas the connected setup in your row 2 will still allow you to complete your row 2 with maximum adjacency in most cases. That's one of the main reasons why NHAS used to always start with yellows in row 2, is in order to have an easy time continuing to score in row 2, and that also makes you a lot less dependent on the token and depend on particular tiles. So if you go into the round as the second player, you can simply base your row 2 choice based on the remaining tile counts. When it comes to what an optimal setup might look like, you might look at something like this. I think this would be fairly standard to go for something like this. Yellows in row 3 is of course always going to be relatively easy to come by, since you only require 6 of the yellow tiles, and blue tiles in row 4, since it is your column row 3 color, would of course be your preferred row 4, potentially scoring up to 6 points. And red tiles in row 3 should also often be a valid option. So something like this would be likely the most standard setup you could get. But aside from that, you have many different ways of playing it. So for example, if you were to consider row 2, you could also get a setup like this where you get whites in row 3 additionally, which is almost as good as filling in the row 2, and you have a little bit more of row 3 focus. And in general, regardless of how you build it, you will always have a use case for every color, and you can conveniently build from the middle, which makes it fairly easy, and which is where I would recommend to build this column the most. Now there's one question left for me to cover, which is if you even need to build a column. And well, given that I made this video on column selection, it might be obvious that building a column is mostly the right call, and when looking at the stats of top players, you will see that most of them build about a column per game, some a little bit less, some a little bit more, but building a column is generally going to be the play. Now, every now and then, the optimal play is to not build a column, and that's something I will go into briefly as well, but it might warrant its own video. Because not building a column is quite a bit different from building a column, and at first it isn't really obvious why that would ever work, right? Since when you build a column, let's say you build middle column, then your final row 5 would be worth 12 points. So you get 5 points for vertical adjacency, and then you get +7 for the column. So how could you ever not build a column and win, right? Like, let's say you don't build a column and you take blacks in row 5, for example. That tile would only be worth 1 point compared to the 12 points the reds would give. So it really isn't obvious why a build like that would ever work, but there are a few reasons for that, which I will have to answer in a different video. Briefly, I would just say that the reason it works is due to top row adjacency and maximizing your upper row scoring. So building something like this, getting these high value rows, and then simply building towards the middle and making sure that you get all of these high value boxes and getting very, very good row 3 scoring to offset the lost column is usually what's going to make it a viable strategy in some games and is not neglectable. But I will have to further elaborate on when to do it and how to do it. To answer how often you should build each column, I would start by saying that column 1 and column 5 you should build less than 1% of the time. Middle column is going to be the most important one, I would say about 50% of the time, and column 2 about 35% of the time. The remaining 15% I would split across column 4 and non-column builds, and that would be my recommended framework for what to build and how to build.